Welcome back to the show. Nice to have you with me. Let's talk about existing home sales for the month of June. How's housing out there? Data was released yesterday morning at 10 o'clock and showed that for the month of June, existing home sales down 2.7%, a little worse than expected and worse than the prior month, up 1%. On an annualized basis, 3.93 million units were sold against 4 million expected against 4.04 million in the prior month. Remember, that's a seasonally adjusted annual rate. So a little weakness in existing home sales, and not surprising. But the financial world really freaked out about this. This is the piece of information they needed to get the Fed to lower rates. These ZIRP addicts, zero interest rate policy addicts, these addicts who want to just take stocks higher. And of course, we know that the Trump administration has been bashing Powell to cut rates. Even though we still have an inflationary problem, the economy is growing around full employment, unemployment. But nonetheless, we're using this data, this lower than expected data, to try to make the case for the Fed able to cut rates here at the end of July in their upcoming meeting. Expectations are them keep rates unchanged. That's my call anyway, and that's what I think the Fed should do. So existing home sales is a very volatile series. These are homes that have already been lived in, that are bought by others. Existing home sales are pretty self-explanatory. And this is not unusual. Now we are near a trend low. That's the lowest number, the biggest drop in 9 months for existing home sales, which is nothing to be concerned about. If you go back to the 1970s, you can see data that's in the same fashion. This 2.5 to 4 million units on an annualized basis. The 1980s, the same way. 1990s, the same way. Early 2000s, the 2010s. It's a volatile series. Rarely do we have 2 or 3 months going in the same direction. Homes are expensive. And as we know, home prices are at an all-time high, driven by the COVID lockdowns. Not by COVID, by the COVID lockdowns. And that pressure is still in the system. But there's something else that's even more important. It's not interest rates. Interest rates for a 30-year mortgage for good credit, 6.5%, 7%, not too far off the historic average, way different from what we saw in the months in a couple of years after COVID, of course, way different from what we saw after the Great Recession, 2008, 2009. That's because the Fed mismanaged monetary policy so badly, bringing interest rates down to zero. And so the real driver for the drop in existing home sales is affordability, so prices, and the financialization of the housing market, the commoditization of the housing market. So it takes us back to COVID. It had been in place for years and years, but nothing like the scale we've seen since COVID. Remember the World Economic Forum, the body that kind of controls most of the politicians around the world, argued for the Great Reset. The idea that you will own nothing, that everyone will rent or lease. And it unleashed an avalanche of financialization of the U.S. single-family housing market. And Wall Street, financial companies, hedge funds, banks went on a buying spree. Late 2020 through 2023, it stemmed off a little bit here. But that's something we should never have allowed. Our elected officials at the federal and state level allowed financialization of the housing market, driven by this idea that you'll own nothing to bring parity between classes. There have been members of the House in Washington, D.C., and members of legislative bodies at the state level looking to force the sale of single-family homes bought by financial investors back to family buyers. You can see this happening in California, New York, North Carolina. Homeowner associations are trying to stop this investing. Remember, the whole idea is financial companies will own housing and they'll rent it to you. And so millions and millions of homes were bought up by deep-pocketed investors who could outbid any individual family investor. And so that has driven up rents, and it's also reduced supply of housing available to purchase. And of course, that drives up prices. In the 2022-2023 period, 1 out of every 4 single-family homes was bought by a financial investor looking to rent that home back to a family or an individual. So this was a big mistake, the commoditization of the housing market, the financialization of the housing market. It should be stopped. Nothing really is cooking strongly on the legislative calendars at the federal level or at state levels to really push this through, because as you can imagine, the political contributions, the support they get from financial entities is quite high, and they have access that the individual home buyer doesn't have. And so if you want to be worried about a drop or a lower than expected level of existing home sales for the month of June, don't look to the Fed. Don't complain about Powell and the FOMC. You got to complain about legislative bodies, financialization of housing, commoditization of housing, and how that must be stopped. We can make a case for corporate ownership of apartments, rental units. When it comes to single family homes on individual lots, we can't allow this to happen any longer. And that's one of the driving main reasons why we have this relatively low supply of existing home sales. Moreover, the big kicker for this was the Fed's, again, drop of interest rates to zero after the COVID lockdowns. That brought mortgage rates down dramatically into the 3 to 4% range, where you're getting 30-year mortgages at 3.5%, 3.25%, 3.75%, money for free for 30 years. Well, those people that took advantage of that timing and bought homes are not going to sell those homes only now to take on a 6.5% mortgage against their 3.5% mortgage. So we have a disincentive to sell existing homes by those who recently bought them in a way we wouldn't have seen in the past, because they have such a low mortgage rate that they're not going to leave that home. And then lastly, we know that boomers own a large percentage of existing homes, and boomers are still there. They're still enjoying their homes. They have huge value built up in them. And so these are the driving forces for why existing home sales are lower than expected and on a decline over the past 9 months. Nothing too out of ordinary historically, but those are the driving forces. There's no denying the correlation between interest rates and number of units sold. Interest rates rise, home sales fall. Interest rates fall, home sales rise. And there's no denying if the Fed would lower rates, mortgage rates would come down somewhat. We're talking 25 basis points, which can be a meaningful change in a monthly mortgage payment, but this is not the be-all, end-all, or savior of the existing home sales market. All right, that's all I have for you right now. Existing home sales for June. Always try to buy American.